Hello and welcome back to ClaudioVisual, the art and visual culture podcast hosted by me, Claudia, hence the humorous name of the podcast. It's nice to see you all again after a little hiatus there for a couple of weeks. Anyway, it's dark. The space surrounding you is empty, devoid of any discernible objects. Your face and chest engulfed by the light shining down upon you. Divine luminescence. Your left hand clutches your paint palette, as your right touches your breast, enraptured, inspired. This is a presumed self-portrait of Francisco de Zurbarán, a Spanish Baroque painter who was living between 1598 and 1664. So perhaps that's how you might have painted yourself were you him. And part of the reason I thought it might be interesting to talk about Zurbarán today, this chap we've just seen having probably painted himself really in that image, is that I, as you might know from other podcasts of mine or from my radio show, I am working on a PhD in Italian sacred painting from sort of the late Middle Ages, sort of early Renaissance, so the 15th century. And sometimes when people ask me what I'm up to and I tell them, they like to throw in the name Caravaggio. So I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of Caravaggio, who is not actually from my time period. He's from the century afterwards. He was a 17th century artist. And he's quite beguiling because he's a bit of a murderer, bit of a thief, bit of a thug, has a few scuffles on bridges, stabs a couple of people, you know, all that stuff that really fascinates. And he's obviously an Italian artist, Caravaggio, probably one of the most famous Baroque artists that we have in a lot of ways, especially from Italy, in any case. But Zurbarán, the chap we've just encountered, illuminated on his breast and head, with his paint palette in hand, he's actually known colloquially as, you know, as a bit of a cute nickname or what have you, as the Spanish Caravaggio. And what I thought we could do today is, rather than look at Caravaggio too much, although we can obviously dabble a little bit, is sort of have a little exploration of some of the artworks of Zurbarán and see how this Spanish Caravaggio is so interesting. So when I say Baroque, I am talking about how, you know, things are classified in the sort of Western cultural canon, so, you know, visual culture, architecture, literature, music, what have you. Baroque tends to be a sort of across-the-board term used for these sorts of cultural pursuits and phenomena across the 17th century and sort of into the early 18th century. So why don't we have a little bit of a look at more of the imagery? So that little fragment, actually, because I didn't explain that it was a fragment. So Zurbarán we just met and enshrouded in darkness there with his paint palette. That is actually a fragment of a larger painting, which actually shows Christ in crucifixion. So we'll have a little look at that in detail right now and explore some of these dark, kind of weird artistic styles that the Baroque period produced, at least in Spain and the mind of Zurbarán, and also comparing a bit with Caravaggio and what have you. So, as I mentioned, Zurbarán was born in 1598, and he's from Fuente de Cantos, a town in the province of Badajoz in the western region of Extremadura in Spain, or in the Iberian Peninsula at least. And nowadays, actually, I think you can go and visit a little museum which is a renovated version of his house, actually, the house that Zurbarán was born in. But anyway, getting back to the painting, we can see that he's executed this presumed self-portrait in the bottom right-hand corner of what's also a crucifixion scene. So you can see a figure of Saint Luke portrayed as Zurbarán himself, purportedly, and he's gazing upon the apparition or the you know, of Christ being crucified, sort of in a devotional sense. He's drawing inspiration for his religious paintings from the very core event of the Christian religion itself, which is obviously the crucifixion. So he's gazing up, completely enshrouded in darkness. And that's what you'll see about some of these Baroque paintings, and we'll come on to this in a second, is that it's very much about a blackened, dark environment with these bursts of light coming from, for example, a lot of the time, just one direction, a very harsh light. So you can see there that the figure of Christ being crucified, you know, you can see all the sinew, all the muscle, the emaciated corpse as he's there suffering his last breath. You can see that the artist has used 4 nails there, depicted 4 nails for Christ to be crucified. So rather than having one in each hand and one through both of the feet, a phenomenon known as triclavianism, actually, if that's of any interest to anybody, Zurbarán has decided to use 4 nails, which is a little bit sort of not unorthodox, but just a bit of a different way to do things. And so yeah, the artist is drawing inspiration. He's got his palette there poised, ready to absorb all of this divine illumination that's coming his way. So Christ is absolutely illuminated on the right side, and on the left, completely sort of not plunged into darkness, but he's sort of merging with the really dark environment in which Zurbarán is also immersed. So considering the dates that I've given you for Zurbarán's lifetime and such, some of you may have put 2 and 2 together and thought, well, you know, he's a Spanish artist, active in the 17th century. He's a counter-reformation artist, so not only is he Baroque in style, but sort of culturally, historically, at this time, was a counter-reformation movement. So as I'm sure a lot of you will know, the Reformation was, you know, a movement kind of contrary to the proceedings of the Catholic Church. And in the Counter-Reformation, which is also known as the Catholic Reformation, because it was a movement combating the reform that had begun in the Protestant Reformation. Actually, one of the greatest tools for this crucial kind of historical political movement of the Counter-Reformation, where the Catholic Church sort of fought back, was actually the instrument of the body itself, and particularly its depiction in you know, visual works, in painting and what have you. And one of the greatest, perhaps arguably, ways to depict the body, the suffering, the real visceral aspects of human embodiment, really, that the Catholic Church was sort of using to combat the puritanical Reformation vibes, was actually this device here that we see in Baroque art, and that is the juxtaposition of really dark environment with stark contrast of the light. So, you know, surrounded by all kind of blackness, as we're seeing here, and then with a really strong light source illuminating in a harsh fashion and a very kind of dichotomizing way, the dark and the light. And this device, this artistic style, as I say, that Zurbarán is employing in this image, for example, is called chiaroscuro. So chiaroscuro is a term used for this pictorial contrast between the light and the dark. And very conveniently, the sun, the setting sun, has just moved in such a way that I can actually embody the notion, because it is characterized by a strong light source, and the figure being, you know, completely illuminated down one side or on a certain, from a certain angle, or what have you, while the rest is obviously comparatively dark. And the term chiaroscuro derives from the Italian terms chiaro, light, and scuro, dark. I'm going to be moving into a better light source. Hello, so I have moved across the room because the sun was blinding me somewhat. The setting sun was quite useful, actually, in illustrating this pictorial style of chiaroscuro, in which a figure and or objects are illuminated quite strongly on one part of them, and the rest is, by contrast, very dark. That was a very useful little fortuitous meteorological happening there while I was sitting in the other chair. But I've moved so as to be a bit more comfortable and not have the sun blinding me. So Zurbarán, as we've seen in the image of the Christ figure on the cross, the crucifixion scene, and what can be presumed to be self-portrait of Zurbarán himself, inspired by this image in order to paint sacred images. We've seen that chiaroscuro has obviously been employed in that image in order to accentuate the suffering of Christ on his body and what have you, and how the artist himself is stricken. So this chiaroscuro is a pictorial device that's particularly suited to these kind of sacred spiritual happenings, really, because it can be so striking, really. It's a very dramatic kind of image. You're half plunged in darkness, you're half, as you just saw with me there, cowering from the sun. And so I also wanted to just sort of, in this little brief introduction to kind of Zurbarán and the sort of Baroque vibe that these artists had, or this, the Baroque tradition. So the reason that Zurbarán is known sort of colloquially as the Spanish Caravaggio is for these reasons, really, because it was really this chiaroscuro device which was so central to a lot of these images, particularly dramatic spiritual images which are about the body or a spiritual experience, the soul, the body, these kinds of tensions. It's all about the soul, the body, how these things are, tearing each other apart in some ways, and how the light and the dark are constantly at this kind of binary sort of tension in some regard, really. So if we have a quick look at a couple of quite famous Caravaggio paintings, which some of you may have seen, here's the painting of Caravaggio's of St. Jerome. So you can see that he is at work at these scholarly pursuits here, and he's sort of very much, again, enshrouded in darkness, but he's got the light shining in quite an intense fashion on the skull, a bit of a memento mori, a reminder that everyone must die, essentially, is what that means. And, he's engaged in these scholarly pursuits, which are also, to very much an extent, religious ones. And, there's an implication there that it's the divine light shining upon him and guiding him onwards, really, to an extent. And then we've got David holding the head of Goliath, the Philistine giant whom he defeats. And that's Caravaggio's painting from it's from 1610. This painting is very much an example of chiaroscuro. I mean, I defy anybody to suggest that there's no real contrast there between dark and light. And that's yet again for another sacred purpose, a very dramatic event. So if this was a bit of a precedent, we can see why Zurbarán and his painting of the Christ crucified, with himself possibly in the corner there, we can see why he would be considered as a kind of, somebody to be inspired by Caravaggio, of course, and why we could understand that he might have this little epithet of being the Spanish Caravaggio, because he's obviously been inspired by very similar styles. And so we can see here his St. Francis standing in ecstasy. Now this painting's very interesting, as you can see that he's employed this chiaroscuro style in order to really make this event dramatic, because although it might look like St. Francis, obviously the Italian saint, it might look like him just sort of standing up there kind of in the darkness or what have you. What's really going on, if you sort of look closely, it looks very much like a cadaver, because this painting is actually based upon an experience, a post-mortem legend, that Pope Nicholas V in 1449 went to go to the tomb of St. Francis in Assisi, and found the dead body standing up in ecstasy. And this is supposed to be a kind of pictorial configuration of the events. So actually using this really dramatic and striking and shrouding in darkness with somewhat of an architectural illusion going on, but of the tomb, but really just this kind of, where is this light coming from? It's very eerie, it's very spiritual, really. So I hope today it's been a little bit of an illumination of some of this device chiaroscuro that was used in the Baroque period in Western Europe, just by taking as an example Zurbarán, the Spanish Caravaggio, and also sort of comparing briefly with Caravaggio himself, who was a bit of a predecessor for him. Because it's an interesting device, and it's been particularly prominent in Baroque painting. So I hope you've enjoyed it. And as for Zurbarán, he spent his last years in a very unsuccessful way and finally died in poverty. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.